Great. Well, welcome to our May 2025 meeting. I have some housekeeping I just want to talk about here first. Uh, for full disclosure, we are recording this meeting. You probably heard a voice come on when you logged in to say recording in progress. We are posting our meeting videos on our YouTube channel, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. In the recording, only the speaker's image will be in the recording, whoever's speaking at that moment. So if you ask a question, you'll be temporarily on the screen. However, for just normal stuff, of course, you can see each other, as you are here. When the presenter is sharing their screen, as I'm doing right now, we recommend you put speaker view on so you just see the person speaking, but you're welcome to set it up however you want. Just remember, other people can see you. So, if you're making faces or whatever, just keep that in mind. So we are a group of men and women from diverse age groups, backgrounds, and levels of education who are interested in scientific research and general evidence that point to God's existence, character, and the Bible's reliability. Our topics lean toward STEM areas of interest, but are not limited to these. If you would like to get on our email list and you're not already, there's the email address to get on. Send an email there and I will add you to the list, triangle-apologetics-community@outlook.com. All right. So this is our agenda for the evening. Some welcome and general information, which we're in right now, some announcements, and our presentation then. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment, but there's the cover of the book there that you can see. And then we'll do some Q&A at the end. All right, so one of my announcements is, of course, we have a YouTube channel, and this is the Triangle Apologetics Community channel. We just put this up in March, toward the end of March, and so what we're doing there is putting up meetings that we have recorded, so the current ones and a few of the ones we did as an RTB chapter, so some of them are there. And I took this screenshot earlier this week, so that's what's there. Our Triangle Apologetics Community, that's the handle that I've highlighted. So if you're on YouTube, you can look for that. And all these videos are there. One more thing about the videos. All of these are available in 4K. If you have a big screen and you got 4K capability, you can take advantage of that. You'll have to go into YouTube to say do it in 4K because that's not the default for YouTube. But anyway, that's our YouTube channel. I wanted to give a couple of announcements about what's coming. So you may be interested in some of these. I'm going to say just a brief few words about these three for June, July, and August. You might be interested in one or more of these. In June, we're going to talk about the neuroscience of transgenderism. Stephen Willing, he's a doctor. He also has an MBA. Let me just read about this one here. What is transgenderism? This term is a very loaded one in our society today and stimulates much discussion and raises many questions. Is this a disease, a habit, an ideology, or something else? Does transgenderism have anything to do with biology? What is neuroscience? What does neuroscience have to do with transgenderism? What does the research show? And how should neuroscience inform our understanding of transgenderism? All right, so that's coming in June. In July, we have Ethical AI by Sean Aish. He's a PhD. He's a cybersecurity researcher at one of the government labs, and in July, we'll talk more about that. Artificial intelligence historically is fancy math that allows you to create models from data that answers questions like, what show should we recommend next for this Netflix user? Is this email spam or not? Is this a picture of a cat or a dog? Advances over the last 15 years have applied this fancy math in new ways that allow us to teach AI models to play games, generate text and images that appear human, and control robots in complex environments. But how are Christians to understand and use AI in a way that honors God? Are we on the cusp of robots that are sentient? Will we all lose our jobs? In this talk, Dr. Esch will help us wrestle with these questions intelligently using information from the brightest minds in AI and Christians who have thought deeply about technology. All right. In August, uh, this presentation, Wellness for the Whole Person, Spirit, Soul, and Body by Jim Painter, also a PhD and a registered dietitian nutritionist. Wellness is more than just avoiding disease. It means living in vibrant health. We are not simply a body, but also mind and spirit. This is based on 1 Thessalonians 5:23. This synergistic triad is inseparable. A poor diet may not just affect the body, but also how we think and our disposition toward others. Similarly, anxiety in your spirit may affect the health of your body. Therefore, for you to truly achieve total wellness, your efforts must include all three dimensions of body, mind, and spirit. We will explore the interplay of spirit on the mind and body, and then provide inspiration and information on developing a peaceful life. So if any of those look interesting to you, be sure and put those on your calendar. But now let's get into tonight's presentation. I have to say, just before I get into the reading into this, Daniel is one of my favorite people in the Bible. And so when we had the chance to do this, and I thought, oh yeah, this will be exciting. Hopefully other people share that excitement. But let's talk about our topic for tonight, Daniel in Babylon, how he navigated politics in exile and what it means for us today. This is by Dr. Mark T. Clark. Daniel lived an exemplary life of faith during historic political events. He excelled at his job in exile while committing himself to God's kingdom purposes for his day. Because he did, he models how people may live exemplary lives of faith by committing themselves to God's kingdom purposes for their day, even in these political times, these troubled political times. In this book, Clark reveals the nuances of Daniel's wisdom while living in exile. He evaluates how Daniel appealed to increasingly higher political and celestial authorities throughout his time in office in two different empires, the Babylonian and Persian. Daniel's righteous living and wisdom in these 5 appeals reveal why he was considered highly esteemed in the kingdom of heaven. In the final chapter, Clark uses intelligence analysis methods to demonstrate the reliability of the authorship of the book of Daniel. Speaking of the new book, this is the cover, and I recently bought it and on Kindle, and so I took a screen grab. And so this is the table of contents of this book. I love it already. I've finished the first 3 chapters. I'm sure I'll get to the rest of it fairly quickly here. This is it's just great stuff. I'll let Mark expound on that. The book is published by, I guess it's WIPF and Stock Publishers. There it is in various forms. You can also get it in other retailers, and there is a discount code for 40% off. So if you're interested, take advantage of that. All right, so let me introduce our speaker tonight. Mark T. Clark is Professor Emeritus of Political Science and former Director of National Security Studies Program at Cal State University, San Bernardino. He specializes in national security affairs, including nuclear weapons, strategy and deterrence, and theories on war. His most recent works examine the theory of war developed by Klaus von Clausewitz as applied to non-state actors, including terrorist organizations, and the deterrence policies of small nuclear powers, including India, Israel, Pakistan, and, when it had them, the Republic of South Africa. He's currently working on extending this work to include Iran and North Korea. In the fall of 2006, Professor Clark received a multi-year grant from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to establish a California State University Intelligence Community Center of Academic Excellence among a consortium of 7 campuses of the CSU system, and in fall 2011, received a second grant to continue the work from the Defense Intelligence Agency. In fall 2013, Clark and a colleague received a National Science Foundation grant to develop new degrees in cybersecurity and intelligence, and was named a member of the Academic Advisory Board for the NATO Defense College for 2013 through 2015. And he served in the U.S. Marine Corps, 1973 to 1977. If you look on the lower left there, there is a study guide to his new book, which is available on his Substack newsletter, and the information for getting that is there. I have downloaded that, and it's a nice set of questions there. So please welcome Mark Clark. Let me make you a co-host here, and then you can share your screen or do whatever you need to do here. All right, I'm going to stop the share on my screen.
I thank you for the opportunity to talk to you and to share the results of this. And I kind of want to give you my personal reason for doing this, because I think it's really crucial in 2 ways that I'll talk about. Early in my career as a professor, assistant professor, untenured at Cal State University, I was leading a graduate program that was not very popular. It was just after the Cold War. It's not mainstream academics. They made sure that I knew that. We need to mainstream you. I was like, please. But the other component was that I was also co-hosting Hugh Ross's show on TBN called Reasons to Believe. And at one point, and I can't remember exactly when, but I remember 2 associate deans pulled me aside and said, "What are you doing mixing up your work with faith? The university shouldn't be identified with Christianity." And, honestly, it was a half-hour discussion. And, having been a Marine, the first thing I wanted to do is kind of get mad and defend myself until I recalled the words of Jesus, blessed are you when you're persecuted for my name's sake. Now, that calmed me down. Now, I know I wasn't persecuted in the way in which people have throughout history during the Roman Empire, throughout the Middle East and China and Africa, but it was nonetheless something that really kind of shook me because I was very vulnerable. I was supposed to be temporarily in this office holding this position of Director of National Security Studies, and it was untenured. And I didn't know how long it would last after that. And I needed to find a way to model how I'm going to live and thrive in this environment. And it was fortunate at that time, Hugh asked me to do this study, a 6-week study on the 5 political appeals that we see in Daniel chapter 1, 2, 6, 9, and 12. And again, from lower level to higher level political authority, human, and then celestial authority. What I would tell you is that in one respect, I was personally able to validate the reliability of the book of Daniel because of its impact on my career. All those grants, all those things that happened to me were not my doing. They were God's opportunities for me, and I took advantage of it. We were the first to actually pass with complete zero defect audits from external sources. So that whole experience was so profound. I even got more grants and contracts than was listed there. But when I retired from Cal State, the very college that harassed me for mixing my faith and my work was the ones that put me into the College Hall of Fame. And again, I give God the glory for that and credit because I really feel like Daniel modeled for me in my study of him how to pursue excellence, how to follow God, how to be respectful of authority, even when you disagree with the culture at large. And I did clearly disagree with many parts of the culture. Well, so that's my personal kind of in, and I wanted you to be aware of that because I come later to a point where I actually demonstrate its reliability in a second way, in a more important way, more substantive way. And I'll talk about that in a minute. You saw the thesis of this piece of the book. Daniel kind of models an exemplary life of faith in troubled times by remaining committed to God's kingdom purposes first. And because he did so, and the way in which he did it, he models for us how we may learn from him how to live a life of faith in our political times. And it doesn't necessarily that you get into high political office. You could be working at a university, you could be working at home. I have some very close friends who I call Daniels of our day. For example, one is just going through a lot of chemotherapy and things, but when she goes to hospital, she's a light for the doctors and the nurses that are there. So the example of Daniel is not meant to be instructive in the sense in which it's a didactic book. It is part of what's called the hagiographa, or the wisdom literature of the Tanakh, the Hebrew version of the term for the Old Testament. And as such, it's not telling you exactly what to do. It's giving you examples how to live faithfully. Kind of like how you think about the book of Job. It teaches you how to think about suffering. The Psalms, how to think about prayer to God, how to worship God. Proverbs, how to live thoughtfully in life. Daniel's like that, but how to navigate kind of political authority, political and celestial authority. Now, I know a lot of you probably read the book of Daniel, but sometimes I fear skipping over people who may not or not understand the background. Let me give you the historical context. So back in the Near East, in the near, kind of Middle East at the time, the dominant power for a while was Assyria, and it was a far more northern kingdom. And in 722, it was so powerful, it destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. The 10 tribes were pretty much killed off. How they were done, what happened is very interesting when it comes later to the Samaritan split and why they're more responsive to the gospel. But essentially, Assyria removed most of the best and brightest out of the northern kingdom and then repopulated with their own citizens. And so a lot of the remaining Israelites intermarried, began to adopt pagan practices, but not all. Some of the faithful adhered to what we would call the Samaritan Bible, which is the first 5 books of Moses. That empire gets destroyed by 612 BC when Nebuchadnezzar and his father Nabopolassar destroy the last remnants of the Assyrian Empire. And in 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar leads the charge into the Levant, which is the area of Lebanon and Israel proper, or Judah, and then Egypt, because Pharaoh Necho of Egypt was sort of the medium-sized power over that region. And he defeats them. And in 605, he withdraws only a few people and takes them back to the empire. And we see specifically Daniel, Meshach, Abshak, and Abednego are the ones taken, and they're to serve in what I call the Masters of Babylonian Administration, a 3-year degree program in Babylon, learning the language, the literature, the customs, probably the theology, the astrology, and all that. So we have bookending these two, around Babylon. Assyria was the dominant power. Israel was a small power. It gets crushed by Babylon at the end. It's now the dominant power for about 70 years. And then its end, Persia takes over under Cyrus the Great. And Daniel serves into high political administration in Babylon and into the Persian Empire, probably for a couple of years, no more than a couple of years. And he writes this book probably in around 538, after the Persian conquest of Babylon. That's at least most scholars believe is the case. So one of the things that I decided to do early in my career is I had taught this course on these 5 political appeals over a number of venues and situations. Zoom calls, scholar calls, apologetic community calls, video things, church settings, small groups, young people, older folks. So it's been fun. And what I've noticed over time is that most people respond with, they get a higher view of God's sovereignty if you really look into the book of Daniel. They have a much higher view of God than politics and history. Because we all know politics can be pretty domineering and pretty dominating. All you have to do is flip on the news and you watch CNN on one channel and Fox News on the other, and you hear the clash of opinions. But what I had decided to do is, my wife and I agreed, Tamara is her name, and I agreed early in my career to invest in the ability for me to retire a little bit early and do this book when I finally got a chance. And that's what we did. We invested in such a way that I could retire and do an early retirement. I fully retired 2 years ago, but for the 5 years prior to that, I was working more than half time, but supposed to only work half time. And that's when I started this book and really kind of dug into it. But one of the things I noticed when I began researching, particularly the political history, cultural history, the anthropology, you name it, the various things that go into understand Syria, understanding Israel, Egypt, Babylon, and then Persia, include the Median Empire and all the other parts to it, is that a lot of historians and a lot of liberal theologians have a very skeptical view of the Book of Daniel. In fact, they say, it was really written by an anonymous Jew in the 2nd century BC, not by an original Daniel. His history's off. It's what they call vaticinium ex eventu, which means prophecy after the fact. And this very much point of view comes out of the Enlightenment, but it actually had a predecessor with a fellow by the name of Porphyry, and he lived between 239 and 305 AD. Porphyry was a Neoplatonist anti-Christian, and he had a real serious axe to grind with Christianity. We don't have any surviving extant works of Porphyry, but what we do have is the writings of Jerome and a few others who contended with Porphyry, the kind of original apologists. Porphyry's comment, he hated Christianity. It may have been the case that he had been a Christian and turned against it, but he was seriously hated the miraculous that it had to be required in Christianity. And he thought that the morals of Christians were so bad that if they weren't willing to give up their faith, they should be executed. And this continues a long trend that we have from the early Roman Empire up until the 3rd+ century, in which Christians are being persecuted for their faith. Well, we don't really, like I said, have much evidence of him other than the writings of Jerome and a few others who wrote about it, and others did, including Augustine. But they point to him as the first example. So what you read, what you hear, if they give any credence to Daniel or to history or to why they disagree, they say this: following Porphyry, everything in the book of Daniel is vaticinium ex eventu. And why they say that is Daniel is really accurate up to about Daniel chapter 11, verse 40. So about the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes was the most heinous king that existed in Jewish history. And he was part of the third empire that Daniel depicts, the Greco-Macedonian Empire. He was a Seleucid, and he was the type of king that outlawed Jewish worship, the reading of the Torah. He defamed and profaned the temple. He slaughtered pigs in the altars in the temple, outlawed Judaism. He literally was one of the first, it could be said by scholars have said, he's probably one of the first to start religious persecution in history. And he was severely anti-Jewish. And so a lot of them will say, well, look, Daniel is really someone writing during this period of time, trying to give hope to the Jews. He's an anonymous guy. He's not really real. So therefore, he's writing history, not prophecy. So one of the things that I determined early on is, there's several other things too, but those are the big kind of objections. If they state them, most don't state it. Most just simply assume Daniel's unreliable. Now, that wouldn't be a concern, except that it's infiltrating some evangelical circles. Wheaton College, for example, there's a professor too there who argue that you really can't look at Daniel as a individual. It's more of a prophetic school. So the school started with someone maybe in the 6th century, but really it's a series of other people who write it. And so therefore it could incorporate this 2nd century view. So one of the things that I decided to do, and I did it the very first part of my research, and I spent quite a bit of time on it, was I employ what's called abductive reasoning, not inductive, not deductive. Abductive reasoning, something that you'll hear Ken Samples talk about quite a bit, is trying to reason to the best explanation. That's a very general thing, and I'll get to some more specific examples later. But one of the things that I had going for me was this kind of long affiliation with the intelligence community, the Director of National Intelligence, Defense Intelligence Agency, and then a project that I didn't list up there is I got to do specific research with the Intelligence Advanced Research Project activity, which is the intelligence version of DARPA. And what we did was really explored how can we make intelligence analysis more comprehensive, more accessible to everyone else, and improve it within the intelligence community. So I employ 2 particular techniques, and it's in Daniel chapter 9, or I'm sorry, the book of Daniel, my book, chapter 9, where I put that on display. And what the analysis of competing hypothesis, the very first one, is you literally build a spreadsheet, and every line on the spreadsheet has a piece of evidence, and there's 44 pieces of evidence. So E1, E2, all the way through. And then vertically, you have, does it support H1, hypothesis 1, that Daniel was a 6th century author? Or is it against it? Is it confirming or disconfirming? Or does it confirm or disconfirm hypothesis 2, that he was a 2nd century author? And the amazing thing, and you'll see it in there, and I went into it with a little bit of trepidation, honestly, because when you read all these scholars, they don't explain where they come up with this. 1 or 2 do, and when you finally get to that, you can actually look at what evidence they portray, but the vast majority simply ignore the book of Daniel. What I found was there's literally 36 confirming items of evidence and only 5 disconfirming for a 6th century authorship. And flip that over, 36 disconfirming pieces of evidence and arguments, and only 5 confirming for the 2nd century hypothesis. Now, why is this important? An analysis of competing hypotheses is intended to be a check on our kind of overconfidence in a particular assumption or particular approach. They do studies all the time with Intel analysts and others. What do you think this is? Here's a scenario. What do you think it is? And it used to be the case that intelligence agencies relied on what they call experts, okay? Someone who is 30 plus years in the field. And while that has great resource value to the intelligence agency, it doesn't always help the younger analysts. What these techniques do is help you check against your overconfidence in your inference that this is, for example, and I bring up the example in the book. A lot of people after Gulf War I, so before Gulf War I, so 1991, we all assumed that Iraq had given up its nuclear weapons, that it really wasn't pursuing them. So Operation Desert Storm occurs, and we found out afterwards, no, they were literally within 6 months of a viable nuclear device. So that got everyone's attention. And so then what they began to do is all the countries of the world began to see that Iraq under Saddam Hussein began doing denial and deception activities to keep us from exploring and finding their nuclear weapons program. What we didn't know is that at some point, Saddam Hussein decided to give up his nuclear weapons, but he didn't let anyone know, including the most senior advisors. And the reason why he didn't do that is because he was afraid Iran would attack him again. Remember, that came on the heels of an 8-year war with Iran. So intelligence agencies were all very optimistic that, yes, he was continuing his denial and deception. Had they done a little bit of a different assumption, a different check on their evidence, they wouldn't have been so optimistic or so confident, overly confident in their assessment that he was continuing. Well, the same thing here. I was willing to go look at all the evidence arguments that are used against the book of Daniel, and is my confidence placed? Is it too high in the trustworthiness of this? I had said earlier that I had a great deal of personal confidence because of my experience with the book and how it helped me live, but I wanted to do an academic version using this technique. And as I say, I really found that this was pretty powerful. It's not that you have the most evidence in favor of your view, because that could be, a lot of people who do research in such a way to confirm their already hypothesis confirming bias, right? If you look at it, people will tell you, well, I've done my research on this particular drug or on this particular thing or on this particular policy. What they mean is they've gone on to look for evidence that supports their opinion. And what you have to do it well is to go look for evidence that goes against your position and give it a fair hearing. And so I did that with this book. But the other thing that comes in, and you had to treat separately, is what we call a technique called the key assumptions check. And a key assumptions check is really important. I mean, I have an assumption that there is a God of the universe, and he's the creator of the universe. And so therefore, a prophecy is not only possible, it's very likely it could occur. But there are a lot of non-Christians and theists and liberal scholars who don't think, or I don't know what they think, they don't come out and state their assumptions, but that either God doesn't exist, or we can't know him, or people lie, and therefore things can be made up. Or that somehow a book that's a work of historical fiction can be useful for the faith if it's not reliable. So I have two chapters, one dealing with two texts or two appendices, one dealing with the key analysis of competing hypothesis. It looks like the evidence doesn't disconfirm the 6th century authorship, it affirms it. And then conversely, for the 2nd century authorship. Well, the assumptions are what cancel each other out, because I've seen it in the literature of those who oppose the book of Daniel. When they actually come out and state their assumptions, which is rare, when they do, they say, well, your assumptions are different than mine, and they cancel each other out. But that gets us nowhere with the evidence and the arguments. So therefore, I spend time on both of these to put into what is called an intelligence assessment. And it's my bottom line up front. The book of Daniel is more reliable than its alternative. And there's 4 principal reasons why, and it's in the book. And I won't labor you with that, but those are the kind of key arguments I come up with. Now, going back to, and if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to ask. I'm kind of going quickly because I don't want to take up way too much time here presenting. But I use generally abductive reasoning throughout. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. What's interesting in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 1, we see that he goes to the chief eunuch, and he's presented, he and his 3 friends are presented there. And what's interesting about that is it's not said that he was made a eunuch, but it was very common practice in ancient Assyria, Babylon, China, Rome, a lot of the pagan countries around there, to make eunuchs out of people that served the court of the king. And so I asked the question: was he made a eunuch? Early church fathers and Jews thought he had been, but when I looked at commentary, Christian commentary, more contemporary, most people tend to gloss over it. They say, well, that term is just used generally. It's just a bureaucratic term. It doesn't mean anything. But I think we miss something if we fail to pay attention to this. If he was made a eunuch, how was it that he displayed no evidence of trauma? How is it that he had such a faithful life and a life of respect for political authority without admitting it? We do know from history people that have suffered being castrated, suffered greatly from the trauma of that. And I cited a research study on a guy named Sun Yat-kin, who was a Chinese guy that worked in the court of the Han court, who was taken to the silk house for supposedly violating some law and castrated. And he lived with that shame even 8 years later, night sweats, nightmares, and the horror that follows from that. And yet he was still made the chief historian of the Han court. So people can actually thrive, but they do struggle with this. But we see no evidence of Daniel ever struggling with that throughout his experience. So I evaluate, how was it likely that he survived that trauma? How was it that he was able to get through that? How did God provide him the means to do it? And I bring in some neuroscience and some therapeutic approaches to kind of play it out. I'm not saying that's exactly the answer, but it fits with the text. The two key things to know about trauma, and this is from a research scholar by the name of Bessel van der Kolk, is that people that experience trauma like this remain stuck in the past as if it's an ever-present reality, kind of like Sun Yat-kin. But if you find the modern therapeutic approaches, there's three kinds. There's the pharmacological, which is to help alleviate the really sadness, the depression, and the anxiety that comes from it, which obviously would not have been available to Daniel. But there's two other kinds. One is called bilateral stimulation. And the other is called, it's top down, it's talk therapy. What we see with the life of Daniel is that he had both in spades. And what I mean by that is he had a small community of like-minded believers who we see praying together very carefully, particularly in Daniel chapter 2, and they walked a long way. So that bilateral stimulation for the mind was able to reorganize it neurologically. So I explain that in the book, and I don't want to go over too much because it's not crucial to the theory, but it's important to see how I use abductive reasoning. Another example I do is why did he choose a vegetarian diet? In Daniel chapter 1 in his first appeal. And, a lot of contemporary scholars, again, look back and say, they look through the lens of the New Testament and say, well, look, Paul said pagans were concerned about eating meat sacrificed to idols, therefore Daniel was doing the same thing. That could be partially true, and there's no reason to think it wasn't partially true, but it doesn't explain everything. Daniel was, the royal court of Babylon was trying to give Daniel and his friends status and prestige and evince loyalty to the regime. Their intention wasn't to defile them, it was to honor them, but then to also wed them much more closely to Babylon. If we look at Levitical law, there are certain things that are prescribed. We all know about that. But wine was not prescribed. But Daniel chooses to not ask for wine as well. So it looks like, and particularly research studies show time and again, the people who are most likely to be influenced by collective pressure are people in their teenage years. And Daniel and his friends were likely teenagers. So it seems like he might have done this more for being wise about setting himself apart from the culture without offending the political authorities. Because he didn't say, you would defile me. He said, let me not defile myself. That's the remarkably mature approach Daniel takes to this whole thing. It's brilliant, and he does this all throughout the book. So those are two examples I also look at, especially in Daniel chapter 6, when the court intrigue tries to trap Daniel and get him thrown into the lion's den. What was the intrigue about? I mean, he had been around a long time. Was it just because he was Jewish, he was foreign, this was a new court? Or is there something else going on? Well, what we see in the book of Daniel chapter 6 is that Daniel is already one of the top 3 of the administrators, overseeing all the wise men to make sure that the king's resources were managed well. And Darius so admired the work that Daniel did that he was going to appoint him chief in charge of all of them, in effect, the prime minister. That strikes me as interesting because if you study modern bureaucracies or bureaucracies throughout the world, bureaucratic jealousy is really typical all throughout history to this very day. Memoirs are written, people are badmouthed, all that. But I think it's really fascinating. I think what's really interesting is that bureaucracies in the contemporary world, but also throughout history, have been a way for people to make money, to enrich themselves. And Daniel had so much integrity that he wasn't going to do that. He was going to preserve the integrity of that regime. And I think the bureaucrats around Daniel, felt threatened by his potential for rule. And so these are techniques or examples of how I use abductive reasoning to think through the problems. And I'm not saying them all are absolutely the right answer, but they're ways to flesh out perhaps the nuances that we see in the book of Daniel that might not otherwise pay attention to. And I found commentators tend to rely too much on a New Testament understanding of the Old Testament rather than trying to live in that world and understand how they might have understood it. If that makes sense. So again, there's 5 political appeals that we see. Daniel chapter 1, you saw the table of contents that Dennis put up. It was appeal for a restrictive diet. What's fascinating is if you look later in Daniel chapter 10, he prays and fasts for 3 weeks, and he has no meat or tasty meat or wine. So clearly he eats meat and drinks wine later in his life, but not at this time. Neurologically, that would have been brilliant for him because it would have been a far healthier diet for a young person at that time when their brain's undergoing massive transformation, neurologically speaking. In Daniel chapter 2, as we all remember, the king, has a nightmare. We don't know what it is, but something about a threat to his regime. And he seeks to kill the wise men. He calls them in and says, you tell me the dream, and if you don't tell me the dream, I won't then understand or appreciate your interpretation of it. And no one can do it. Well, this is perfectly set up, but he does make an appeal for a little more time. And this is where he meets with his 3 friends, and they pray to the God of heaven for insight and wisdom that God provides Daniel. How long did it take? We don't know. A day, 2? It seems unlikely it would have been very long because Arioch, the commander, when Daniel sees him, he basically says, what's the rush? Why are you in such a hurry to execute all the wise men? And Arioch says, well, it's because of the king's decree and the importance of it. Now, what's fascinating there is that Daniel must have had, even though he was very junior, must have had a great relationship both with the chief of the eunuchs and Arioch, as well as the bodyguard that's put in charge of him, to be able to have that flexibility, that ability to interact with them at that point. And that's fascinating. So he does get the request made, but then when it comes time to reveal, he says, I have your dream. God gave me the dream in a night vision, and I have its interpretation. Arioch takes credit for it. Says, King Nebuchadnezzar, oh, live long forever. I have found someone in the empire able to know your dream and interpret it. Daniel doesn't check him on that, doesn't call him on that falsity. He never does this stuff. So he gets that wish, and he gets that will, and he's developing relationships, showing respect and showing tact and wisdom beyond his years, still a very young person. In Daniel chapter 6, when the king's trapped into putting into a law that, the laws of the Medes and Persians are different than Babylonian laws. The laws of the Medes and Persians cannot be revoked, even by a king. And so Darius knows it. As soon as it's revealed, well, King Darius live forever, there's a man in your kingdom who's worshiping his own God, a practice that Daniel did throughout his life, going up to his apartment, looking out towards Jerusalem, and praying 3 times a day. They clearly set this up to trap him. But Daniel doesn't say anything, and that becomes another good question. Why did Daniel not say anything? And it's in the book, you read it, it's really kind of cool. Daniel chapter 9, we all know, is fascinating. Daniel chapter 9 is where he reads the prophecies of Jeremiah about the 70 years of captivity, realizes it's coming, and he begins the prayer of repentance and restoration. It follows on a lot of good stuff in the Tanakh that I talk about. But what's fascinating is, in addition to probably prompting God to initiate the return of the Jews through King Cyrus to issue the edict, he probably prompts it because of his humble approach, but he also then gets an answer from an angelic being, a celestial being, about the future coming of this anointed one who'll be cut off. And so there we have the best evidence of an Old Testament prophecy of something that's going to occur around the 1st century. Now, why is it fascinating? There's a number of scholars, Christians, faithful, conservative, I think, who agree that the book of Daniel's good and all that, but they can't settle on what that means. What's fascinating historically is that 3 sects of Jews during this period of time, during the 1st century, actually believed the Messiah was imminent. The Essenes, the Zealots, and the Pharisees, they all believed the Messiah was coming soon. And what's fascinating is that the Pharisees do not begin to reinterpret this prophecy in Daniel 9 until that end of that first century when the promised Messiah doesn't return according to their expectations. The Zealots, as you know, they had a great deal of messianic hope to bring back the king. And that led to Rome coming in and crushing the temple and killing them off. And I don't know if you've ever been to Rome, you've seen the Titus Arch underneath. It's the last time we've seen some of the temple artifacts that are in there. Last time in history we've ever seen it. So Daniel 9 is his prayer for repentance and restoration, which he does so well. And then finally, he has a series of visions and understandings in Daniel chapter 10 through 12. But he gets to a point, and this is where, again, some of the critics of Daniel say, well, this history gets confusing because what we know about Antiochus Epiphanes, who lived about 174 to 163, doesn't behave this way. He dies in Persia. He doesn't die in Jerusalem. Well, the Antichrist dies in Jerusalem, not in Persia. So what's interesting is that he wants more information. What will the outcome of these things be? And Gabriel denies him. And there's a reason for that we can talk about in a minute or two if you want. What's fascinating is that one of the things that confounds modern scholars is prophecy itself. I don't think they like it. They certainly don't like apocalypse, the idea that God will reveal stuff. And so they look for ways to denigrate it. But Christians and a lot of theologians have noted for years that there is such a thing as a type or typology that exists in the Bible. Antiochus Epiphanes is a type of the final coming Antichrist, the final bad ruler. And if you look back in Daniel 7 and 8, Daniel 7 is about the fourth empire, and there's a type, the Antichrist there, that is called the heinous king. In Daniel chapter 8 is the second century Antiochus Epiphanes, and they conflate those two. And so what's interesting is that Daniel evinces a lot of evidence for what's going to happen yet future, on through to the end of time, including persecutions of both Jews and righteous followers of God. So Daniel, this is the only appeal that Daniel has that is denied. Daniel, go your way. And here's an interesting thing that I look at. I don't know if you've ever read the works of Michael Heiser, The Unseen Realm. Michael Heiser is a theologian. He passed away about the time Timothy Keller did. He's got a lot of work he's done on, and everything he's got in his works are peer-reviewed into the book. He does this whole component he does about the celestial beings in the Old Testament. What we tend to call angels, the New Testament calls angels, in the Old Testament, malach or angel was simply a messenger, but there's a bunch of others that are much higher than that, the Tsar or the prince, like the Prince of Greece, the Prince of Persia. These are celestial beings that rule over nations and countries. And we get a picture of international politics, international conflict that is much higher, a cosmic spiritual view, only in the book of Daniel. And we get somewhat in Revelation, but out of the Tanakh, that's the only place, other than the Table of Nations, where we get kind of a picture of international politics. So what's interesting is Heiser makes this case, which I think is interesting. He calls it the Messianic Mosaic. The Messianic Mosaic is this idea, Heiser points out, that you could not take one single prophecy with any specificity and point to Christ. And remember, on the road to Emmaus, the disciples were following and talking with this person. They didn't know who it was Jesus. And he had to give them instruction and tie in together all the scriptures and how it painted him. And then in the upper room, or the room that they went to afterwards, he also had to open their mind spiritually. So this means that, and Heiser makes a point, that the Messianic Mosaic is a picture of all this, but it wasn't concrete enough because of what we see in 1 Corinthians 2. Paul says, had the rulers of this age known what would happen, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. It was a mystery. It was intended to be a mystery to confound these celestial beings who were rulers over these places, and human rulers as well. But more importantly, the celestial beings. But I like that term, the Messianic Mosaic. It really began to fit with my understanding of particularly the end time stuff that Daniel gets into, particularly in 10 through 12, that what we have also is what's called the prophetic mosaic. We have enough evidence to know where to go, but we don't know specifically how it will happen. How will the Antichrist rise? How will he be put in charge? How will the final battles go? We don't know that data. The angel Gabriel says people will go here and there and knowledge will increase. but the righteous will remain righteous and the unrighteous will remain unrighteous. In other words, we're going to have the same thing. And it's sort of like just as the Messianic Mosaic was what we call compartmented intelligence, that is to say, you didn't really get to know what it was until it had a need to know, so too will we not know at end times how it will all play out until we need to know. And that's where I think Daniel 11 comes in. It's just a really cool idea that people go to and fro, knowledge will increase, but we won't really know until we need to know. But the righteous will continue to be righteous and the evil will continue to be evil. So I want to kind of wrap this up and then let questions and stuff come up. But I want to say that there's probably a couple of major takeaways from the book of Daniel for me. I mean, there's multiple ones, but I'll give you a couple. First, it's given me a much higher view of God's sovereign control over human and cosmological history. There's a spiritual cosmic geography that goes on over international conflict. And when I look to what God's doing, his kingdom purposes first, and because my field is national security studies and international politics, one of the things that I do is look at, okay, war in Ukraine, how can we support missionary activities that will support the victims of Russian aggression? Civil war in Syria, how can we support and give resources to those who are taking care of Syrian refugees who might not have ever gotten a chance to hear the gospel inside Syria or in Yemen or in Congo, or in any number of conflicts throughout the world, eventually perhaps China as well. So just as Daniel always looked to God first, he looked to his kingdom purposes, I made me want to look more towards God's kingdom purposes, even with awful things like wars and civil wars and conflicts the way they occur. In the context of my job, in the context of politics, in the context of just living daily, the other thing that Daniel did so well is that in every case, he looked to the intention of the king, or the celestial ruler, celestial being, first before he decided what to act. So he looked at God's kingdom purposes. What role do I have in this? And then he looked at the intention of the ruler, and he was able to remain respectful. Let me go back and give you an example again. In the case of the vegetarian diet, it wasn't the case that Nebuchadnezzar's court was trying to kill or hurt Daniel or defile him. It was to make him an honorific member of the society, to give him prestige and status, to wed him more deeply into Babylonian culture. Daniel understood that and was willing to say, okay, the intention is to be healthy. Let's try an alternative. And that's why he had so much wisdom. You go throughout the whole book, the same thing. He looks at the intention of the ruler. Why did he not say something to Darius? When Darius said to him, look, your God will save you. Will he save you? Why did Daniel not say a thing? And it's because the king would have been humiliated. He was already humiliated by his advisors that put him in this trap. Daniel didn't want to embarrass the king further. So with wisdom, he declined to say anything. And only after he was delivered from the lion's den did he say, King, I'm innocent before God and before you, the king. And that's when Darius had the others thrown into the lion's den. The other thing I get is a higher view of, again, not just God and kingdom purposes, but a higher view of God over our political leadership. It's said in scripture that the king's heart is like a watercourse in the hands of the Lord, that God sovereignly controls the destiny of nations, that he controls peoples even. The Egyptians he encouraged them to want to get rid of the Jews, to leave the Exodus. It gives me a much higher appreciation for how God uses international politics, regular politics, even the screaming politics we have today in our country. So those are some of the big takeaways. Those are some of the major ideas. There's a lot more to go into, but I think we can start with questions from there if you're okay. Give me a chance to take a sip and get my throat back in order here. Please, Dennis.
Super. Thanks, Mark. So if you have questions, just unmute yourself and ask your questions or type it in the chat box.
No, I gave you a lot to think about, so it's okay. Think for a minute.
So I've got a question a little bit on your analysis of the guys who think Daniel was a second century, or the writer of the book of Daniel was a second century guy. Did you say that most of them, or maybe none of them, did the same kind of analysis that you did, where you just list everything and then just see how it all adds up?
The closest to that is I have the book. It's hidden away right now. Hugh lent me a book. He debated in the introduction when Hugh introduces it. He debated a guy that was charged of the Skeptics Forum, a guy named Tim Callahan. He tries to do it, and it's about, in his view, failed prophecies. Um, he was the closest one that actually evaluated it in that way, but he didn't do it systematically like I did. He just goes through and says, no, this didn't happen, or this did, or whatever. And what I found is that, to me, now to give him credit, if you look at the first introduction in his book, Tim Callahan's book, um, you get the impression, and he didn't come out and say it exactly this way, but I get the impression, and I pointed this out to you, is that his wife may have been in a fundamentalist church and was probably likely abused by the church. It didn't say physically or sexually, I don't mean it that way, but somehow spiritually abused. And I think to give him credit, he was probably trying to defend the honor of his wife and her life. But he does it in a way, and this is the part that bothers me, that's both dismissive and hypothesis confirming, meaning he's only looking for evidence that supports his view, and he tends to ignore all contrary evidence. Let me give you an example of that. He says, well, look, there's 3 Greek words for musical instruments in the book of Daniel, and there's only 3. That's fine. Okay, well, if it's situated, and this is the point, if it's situated in the 2nd century, that is, an author is, then it would make sense he would use Greek because Greek, the Macedonian Empire, had Hellenized Judaism and in the Levant for 160 years. The problem is the contrary evidence is actually those 3 musical instruments. Edwin Yamauchi, a very good evangelical Christian scholar, has done good work on this, pointed out that anywhere from between the 10th and the 8th century BC, those 3 words would easily have been in the Near East because Greek mercenaries were always being hired by the court of Near Eastern monarchs. And so Greek mercenaries would have brought their instruments with them, the kithvos and a few other things. What he fails to do, though, is then look at the contrary evidence. The contrary evidence is that Daniel uses 15 borrowed or loan words from Persian. All of them have to do with governance. That's interesting. If he would have been situated in the 2nd century and it was Hellenized as strong as it's been, you would have expected him to use more Greek words for government rather than Persian, because a lot of Persian history had been lost. A lot of Babylonian history had been lost by this time. So that's an example. It looks to me like they're going for their own hypothesis confirming bias. Their research is only looking for evidence that they say, look, what about this? What about this? What about this? And not looking at the whole thing as a whole. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Sure.
Mark, are you at all familiar with the work of Chuck Missler? I heard a series of lectures that Chuck Missler had on the Book of Daniel many years ago, and I was impressed by it. Although I was not, this was even before I knew about Reasons to Believe, and I think, as it turns out, he's a very conservative, probably young Earth guy. But are you familiar at all with Chuck?
I've heard of him. I've not read his work on
Okay.
I brought Josh McDowell and a few others. There's a bunch that are listed in the book that I've looked at, but Chuck Missler's, if it was a series of lectures that, unless it was put into a book or a pamphlet or a paper form, I tended to look only at, where possible, look at peer-reviewed stuff first.
Yeah.
Or original source material and not lecture notes, because that's a little more difficult to track.
Okay. I think he did. I think he did write a lot about the lectures that he gave, but I'm not sure, to what extent this exists now, but.
Yeah, and I haven't seen a lot done on Daniel lately. Josh McDowell's is pretty old. I am like 30 plus, maybe 40 years old. Gleason Archer had written a lot in his Survey of the Old Testament introduction and a few other places. He's done quite a bit, but he does it for everything, so he can't devote as much time to the one. I mean, he does. He goes 2 chapters to Daniel, but he doesn't spend as much time on a lot of, but I do get a lot of my clues and cues from Gleason Archer, who is, as you know, a profoundly accomplished linguist. I think the last estimate, he had either was able to read fluently or speak fluently 33 languages, including Palestinian Aramaic, Imperial Aramaic, which is the Eastern kind, which is the evinced in Daniel's Aramaic portions, and then a bunch of contemporary languages, and I think Hebrew and Latin and Greek, and it was just a profound scholar in many ways.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another totally unrelated question is, I'm assuming, based on what you're saying, that the book of Daniel, that there was no uh, nothing found in the scrolls that they found, like that had the book of Isaiah in it, and the
The Dead Sea
Essene text. Pardon?
the Dead Sea Scrolls.
The Dead Sea Scrolls. Yeah.
Yeah, no, all of the original of Daniel was in there. That's what it's interesting. In fact, that's a strong argument in favor of Daniel's authorship from the 6th century, is that community of Qumran existed around 150, about the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. There's no way they would have regarded this as canonized and holy and inspirational with someone so recent as, a few years.
Mhm.
In fact, in Jewish tradition, Sid Lehman, and I did a lot of research with this, he does a lot of the canonization process of the Tanakh, the Old Testament. He's a Jewish scholar. He believes the book of Daniel was probably canonized by 2nd century, but he also believes that likely the books of the Old Testament, the Tanakh, were canonized in this sequence: the law of Moses. In Daniel 9:2, we see Daniel refers to Jeremiah, so it's likely the major prophets were canonized by about Daniel's time, and then probably no later than the late 5th and 4th century, the hagiographa or the writings, because even the Jewish scholars realized from the 4th century on, there's no more prophecies given. So that's what's interesting to me, is that the 2nd century Qumran scrolls. There's a lot of other things too. Bel and the Dragon. There's a whole series of things in Qumran, but they don't evince any of the coherence or template that you get with Daniel and the other holy books. In the Jewish tradition, a book was considered canonical if it was considered both, it had to be inspired and canonical. Canonical meant to them it was instructive for daily practice, religious practice. Inspired was meant spoken by or to the prophet by God, or to the prophet by God. And Daniel was always accepted that way. And again, only in Jewish tradition, the Pharisaical tradition, did a change in like late 1st, early 2nd century AD, because the prophet didn't come. And they didn't actually change it. They changed the Masoretic text to try to fudge a little bit on the terms of what the anointed one meant and who it was. But they never didn't include that in the prophet and the part of the canon. And Jewish scholars considered the sacred writings, the holy writings, the hagiographa, and the prophets on equal footing. And of course, they gave primacy to the laws of Moses, but the other two were equally canonical and inspired, according to the Jewish scholars.
Great. Anybody else?
Read the book. It might help.
That's part of the problem. We haven't read the book, so
Yeah.
this is all very new to us.
Yeah, I've only gone through chapter 3, so some of what you said, I said, oh yeah, I remember reading about that, but the rest of it I haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is I had a really fun experience. My wife, we go to Colorado in the summer. We're going next week, and we fly fish, we mountain bike, we play pickleball, we do all these things, and then we have a local river for our community association, and she'll often take off and just go fishing by herself. And she's left me alone. I've been working and reading and writing stuff. When I'm finally getting into the, doing copy editing, got the contract, and doing copy editing, and then finally doing typesetting, I said, Mara, I really need your help to look at this, because I have 2 weeks. I have to go through every single space and make sure every jot and tittle is correct on this book, because once it's done, it's done, it's gone. So would you look at everything after me? And she goes, okay. So I give her a chapter, and I'm working on another one, and all of a sudden she comes in, where's the next chapter? And then she'd go back and work on, where's the next chapter? I can't stop putting this down. It's like a mystery. It's like, this is great. And she read it so fast, she had to read it twice. And then she's read the book. And then she's read the book of Daniel. And she's really engrossed. And she finally goes, and this is my favorite. This is the best selling. She's better at selling it than I am. She goes, I kind of knew what you were doing. I've heard you talk about it. I knew you were working and writing, but I had no idea you had so much time to do it. This thing is excellent. That's her assessment. That's my wife. which is amazing because she's a marriage family therapist. She does very different things. She's not not an academic like I am. But to have your wife say it, now I know what you're doing for those 6 years, that actually made me feel pretty darn good. I wasn't just goofing off. So,
Is the book available on RTB in RTB store or just on Amazon, or where is it available?
I think Dennis listed, you can put that up maybe in a little bit. It's
Yep.
on the Whip and Stock homepage. And if you do go through Whip and Stock, you can get a 40% discount using the coupon code
I'm
called
going to put that up right now. Yeah. Let me just share that.
It's on Amazon. It's on a couple of others. But yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I bought my Kindle version obviously from Amazon.
And it's not that much cheaper from what I hear, is it?
It was $10.
Oh, okay. That's not too bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you go to the Whip and Stock page with the name and get it, and then apply this discount code that's on the right side of your screen, you'll save 40%. If you go to Amazon, it's $26. I think it's, yeah.
Seems to me like RTB ought to have it in their store.
I would agree.
Oh, well, that's not
Well,
not the first book that I've found that's missing from
Yeah.
RTB's store, but
Hugh did write the forward, and they bought some books, and they're giving it to friends. So that's
okay. Yeah.
And I just did a podcast on this with Ken Samples and Joe Geary this last Tuesday. I don't know when it'll be published, not for a few weeks. I also have a Substack page. I don't think it's up there, but I have a Substack page that has a series of study guides and other kind of resources that you might find useful if you're interested in.
Down on the lower left side of that screen
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, if you go to that, there's a series of study questions for free. This is free. It's not, I'm not trying to make money. I retired already. My retirement's fine. I do this because it's a passion of mine to get people to really elevate their understanding of God and Daniel, the book of Daniel, and hopefully it honors God in a way that the way Daniel, I think, honored God.
I'm going to put my browser screen over here so you can all see it. This is the Amazon page. The $26 paperback, $9.99 Kindle. They want extra for hard copy or for hardcover. So there you go.
And you know, if anyone is interested in getting a Amazon, I think you have to buy it through Amazon to write a review on Amazon. I would personally appreciate anyone wanting to write a review about. I think I have one review on Amazon right now, and it turns out it was the guy that led me to Christ in the Marine Corps. So I appreciated that by him.
Let's just take a look. There it is. All right, cool. Oh yeah, I've got your newsletter page up here, your Substack page.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. And you can see the Daniel Babylon is the free study guides in the middle. It's posted, it's there so you can get to it.
Yes, I've already looked at it. Yeah.
Okay. And then there's two more podcasts. Well, one's a podcast and one's a webinar on the left side.
Mhm.
The top one, that's a podcast I did 3 weeks ago that just got published this Wednesday. And then the webinar I did about a month and a half ago on that. You can see it's March 17th. That was an interesting one. It's to the Association for the Study of Middle East and Africa and Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. I'm president of ASMIA, and I'm on the board for SPME, and that's largely a Jewish organization, academic association, not entirely. SPME is largely Jewish. But what's fascinating is that most of my scholars are secular or Jewish, observant Jews. And we had a great time doing that interview. So that was kind of fun.
I watched that one. That was a good one to watch. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Let me stop my share here. We'll go back to normal mode. All right.
We should just circle back in a year after everyone's read the book and bring questions.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else?
You know, and before you read my book, reread the book of Daniel and then
Yes.
make it a companion piece, because mine is selectively focused on his appeals. So everything I do leading up to those appeals and at the end is supporting the reliability of the book of Daniel and how I'm approaching it. But the book of Daniel is the key. It's the one, it's the key thing. It's not my book, it's the book of Daniel.
Mhm.
God works through his word better than we work through ours, I think. So.
Yeah.
Is there any particular English version that you prefer, NIV or NASB, or are they all about the same?
I really like ESV, generally speaking, better than NIV. But here's a funny anecdote. I went into it with doing the NIV thinking, because I had an older NIV, 2008 copy, and I'd heard that, you can publish up to 500, scriptures without copyright issues from NIV. So I pursued it on the basis of that. And I wrote the whole book doing that. And finally, when I get Whipple sends me the author's guide, I found out, whoa, it's got to be the 2011 edition. So I had to go buy a new one and go back to and make sure the changes were. And it really was instructive, the changes. It wasn't bad, but I preferred the earlier version better. But then I found out the ESV, after I'd finished, I could have cited up to 500 verses without copyright permission. And so I regret that, because I think it makes it I think the ESV is just a little bit better in many ways. I think what they did in the updated version of the NIV is they kind of, where it would say man and it meant we could mean anyone, they changed it to anyone. And it took some of that old language out, which anyway, that was
Very woke.
and it's not as woke as you think, but it's more woke than I
No, I don't think that it's woke at all, but not
Yeah.
NIV, but
yeah.
but yeah, so that's
Yeah. Yeah, it is what it is. So
yeah.
So my bad. Next time I'll go to the ESV and cite less than 500 and make sure that's so I don't get in trouble with copyright. Yeah.
Quick question.
Go ahead.
Just a quick question on that. Can you cite like 400 from one and then 400 from another one?
I didn't know that. I wouldn't want to do it for consistency's sake. I'd rather,
Right.
because in the NIV version, they're the ones that do the Unix, but they change it. Not in Isaiah, in the Isaiah reference, I don't know if you recall this, but in the early Isaiah reference, Isaiah 49, Isaiah chews out Hezekiah because he allows the earlier, 100 years before, Babylonian envoys to see the temple treasury. And God's upset with them. So Isaiah chews them out and says, because of what you have done, some of your descendants, your very own blood, is going to be taken as eunuchs to the court of Babylon, as well as the temple treasury, which exactly happens with Daniel during that time. The problem was then the NIV goes and talks about the court officials instead of eunuchs, but it's the same word. And I don't know why. Again, that's like glossing over the unwillingness to confront a terrible truth. I mean, and I point out in the book, as you probably already read, genital mutilation goes on to this day in the world. It's over 2 million, 3 million, 22 some odd million women are generally mutilated, and over 2 to 3 million are generally mutilated every year for no medical benefit. And there's long-lasting trauma that comes from that. And so I kind of talk about that because the same thing would have happened to males as well. So, yeah. But I said, let's look at the hard truths. Look at the harder stuff. It's okay. I think our God is. I think the Bible is so reliable and so trustworthy. We just have to use our mind, will, emotion, and work your butt off to make it happen. But there's great stuff that you can integrate in the world today with the Bible. So. Tail off. I shouldn't have said that. Sorry.
I have a good question. Can you hear me?
I can.
All right. So interesting question. I'm not totally convinced about this, but do you think Daniel had connection to the Magi?
Good question. Very good question. So there's multiple things to that. So the Medes, remember what's called in Daniel, it's called the empire is given over to the Medes and the Persians.
Yeah, they were different countries.
Well, let me explain why that's important. The Medes and the Persians, in Daniel's time, the Persians were a small group. They were, especially if you look in the previous prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah, it was the Medes that were going to be the dominant power. The Persians were a minority. It was Cyrus, who was half Mede, half Persian, that conquered. So it was an empire of the Medes and the Persians. What's cool about it?
Married the daughter of the Median king.
Mandane, exactly. So what's interesting about that, the Magi come out of the Medes, They were the version of the wise men of the Median Empire, and they were incorporated into the Persian Empire. I once asked you, I said, where do you think the Magi or the wise men got a view of the time for the Messiah? And he said from Daniel. And I think he's absolutely right. If you think about it, Daniel 9 gives the prophecy. The Jews, the Essenes, and others believed he was coming about that time. And the Magi probably carried on that tradition because he had such close affiliation with them. So I think we don't know for sure. I mean, the problem with both the Medes and the Persians, they didn't write a lot down. So a lot of history is having to be done inferentially about both Medes, particularly the Medes. They were a horse people for a while. The only thing we really know about them is from the Assyrians, who would fight them often. So in cuneiform tablets and things that we have a better picture. But the Magi certainly were part of the Median Empire, and then later became part of the Persian Empire, and certainly hung around for years. That tradition continued up to the time of Christ.
Yeah, I think the Alexander destroyed a lot of that stuff too.
Say again?
Alexander destroyed a lot of that stuff too.
Well, and in Herodotus reports that actually Cyrus destroyed a lot of Babylon. Herodotus in 450 writes his history, and he fails to mention Nebuchadnezzar and the others. I mean, a lot of the stuff that Herodotus is good for is not good for accurate history, because a lot of it has been destroyed under Xerxes. Actually, not by Cyrus, but by Xerxes later, 480. So when he's writing in 450, a lot of that historical evidence was gone. So thank you, Michael. That's a good question.
Okay, anybody else? All right then. Well, Mark, thanks quite a bit for tonight and for writing this book. I know I'm enjoying it and eager to get to the rest of it. Thanks all of you for coming. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father, thanks for being sovereign and for through the book of Daniel giving us clues about how much higher is your sovereignty than we might think. Thanks for Mark's work on this, and thanks also for Daniel and his dedication to you. We pray all these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, guys.
All right. Good night, all. Thank you. Yes, thumbs up for sure.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks all, and we will. I'll get this video probably posted by end of day tomorrow, so we should have it up right away.
That's good. Thank you. And I'll have it up on my Substack page if you go to it.
Yes, I'll send you the link.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Ladies, folks.